Okay, we are live. Welcome to Genius Spark. So we're going through the book, Genius Spark. We're up to chapter 5. Chapter 5 is to visualize, to verbalize, and to materialize. And before we get into the chapter, I'd like to remind us of where we've been through the journey of the book. We open up with startling information, and that startling information is we were geniuses at one time and we lost it. Chapter 1 is all about rediscovery, the aha, the awakening, and a lot of tools are available to help us get a roadmap back to the things that we naturally do best and enjoy most. But also, you can go back through your history and find those highlight moments and begin to compile them. That's a process I've been through, but we can get there more quickly, get the pinpoint, then go back and add the highlight stories. And we'll talk about that. Once we've rediscovered, then what we want to do is begin to activate or reignite that inner genius and see what it looks like. Then breaking the cycle is chapter 4. And breaking the cycle is essential because it's like carrying a 60-pound backpack up a mountain. It's hard to go forward when you've got so much inertia and stuff in our lives, habits and thinking and patterns that will get in the way. That's a very important chapter before we get into the activation chapter, which is visualize, verbalize, and materialize. Now, I know that sounds a little bit like one of those success motivation mantras, but it's really based on brain science. And what I'd like to go into first is the brain. Now, this part isn't in the book, but I think it's important to know that what we're doing is not magic. It's not a quick fix, a silver bullet. There's a lot of work going into reworking the pathways that we've built over years, in my case, 69 years, and rework the stories we tell ourselves, the habits that we have, the default behaviors, all of those things. When we look at the brain, what we want to start out with is looking at what the brain does. And the brain is designed to do two things: to get you what you want and to save you from the things that might kill you. With those two things in mind, another thing we need to remember is calorie count. The average amount of calories that a human consumes is somewhere around 2,000. So imagine that the brain is consuming 30% or more of those calories. It's the most calorie consuming organ in our body, and for that reason, it only comes alive and really functions at its best in those two scenarios. I really want that, or I need to watch out and be aware of what's getting in my way. In another book, we talk about that worry, anxiety, vigilance side of the brain that used to only be activated when the mammoth was tracking us down or in fight situations. But today, because of our imagination, that stays on a lot. Another consequence of that is that people are very tired, fatigued, have high cortisol levels or stress levels in their bodies, and then that's another part of the reality that we work with. Part of the good news is that when we're playing to our strengths, we're releasing positive hormones, not cortisol. We're releasing the dopamine and the endorphins and the serotonin and the oxytocins. This is another reason why being our best self and having the kinds of stories that reinforce who we are at our best, and the mindset and the outlook, looking at the world in that stoic mindset of the obstacle is the opportunity, or I don't fail, I either succeed or learn. Those are key habit thinking patterns that we'll talk about a little bit more. Ahmed Sood, the doctor at the Mayo Clinic, has done a lot of work on happiness and how the mind can be redirected, because 80% of our day, the brain is in what we call default mode. He calls it mind wandering or mindlessness. It's just thoughts not directed or not on purpose. And 80% of that goes naturally towards the negative. Some people explain it because it's our natural survival mechanism. So there's a couple things that we can pull upon that are developed. One is this concept called mindfulness. And all mindfulness is the ability to focus your thoughts. Whether it's in concentration, that's mindfulness. Whether it's in play, that's mindfulness. It's focused thoughts in an area that we want to think about on purpose. And that's a habit, and that's part of the wiring. There's 3 stages or phases our mind is in. It's focus mode or mindfulness. It's mind wandering or mindlessness. And then there is daydreaming. That's mindlessness on purpose. And that's where a lot of our creativity comes from. One of the quotes in the book is, visualization is daydreaming on purpose. So now that we know that the brain consumes 30% of our calories, the body is in conservation mode to save as many calories as possible for the most important events, that birthed a whole science around what's called behavioral economics. In other words, how does our body make decisions in default modes? What we find, and this is the work of Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, both won the Nobel Prize in economics, says that the brain, because of this, works in what's called rule of thumb fashion or heuristics. For most of the time, 80% of the time, the brain is in default mode. Let me give you a situation or a scenario for that. You're driving down the road on a highway, it's clear and it's straight, and you're having a great conversation with the person next to you. We can do those things because the driving, basically, we're in default mode. We've all experienced driving and then not remembering what was going on in the last 10 miles or so, because the brain is in default mode. Now you've moved to a 2-lane country road off the highway, and you've got this big tractor with a hay bale behind it, and you can't see around it, but you want to pass. And you begin to pull out and see, I've got a clear space ahead that I can pass. You will no longer be able to carry on that conversation because the brain clicks into that focus mode, that mindfulness mode. And so it automatically shuts off the default mode because survival is at hand. That's the basic mechanics of the brain. And what we learned in behavioral economics is that we can hack the brain, neurohack the brain to work on our behalf. One of those neurohacks is the habit of forming habits. In a post I sent a long time ago, I said that I think the 21st century super skill is the habit of forming habits. And interestingly enough, on LinkedIn, it got more than 35,000 hits on it. It's the one that's got the most, and a lot of it is because of recognizing that this skill is something we all struggle with, but it's a necessary skill for us all to have. We've all also noticed how people hack our brains too with this, what's called behavioral economics or change architecture or change design. Have you ever been supersized, gone in and looked at, well, for another 50 cents, I can supersize things? Or when you see a legal document, your brain says, oh, what can hurt me there? I don't want to take the time, too much cognitive calories to spend on that. Unless you're a very unique individual, I don't know anybody who actually reads those software agreements that you go down and you just scroll and then hit agree at the bottom of it. Let's talk about why athletes visualize. Athletes are probably the best example we've got of where this practice has been taken to a fine art, where it's done routinely. Part of it is because when you're rehearsing, when you're imagining, so let's use another word besides visualizing because that has some connotations to it, but when you're vividly imagining what you're about to do, when athletes are put into an fMRI, that's a brain scan machine, looking at the activity of the brain, it is identical to actually doing it. Number one, rehearsal in the brain, when it's vivid and realistic, is similar to doing it in real life. You can go to YouTube and look up Blue Angels rehearsal, and you'll see a video of a group of pilots around a U-shaped table with the commander going through all of the steps of the routine, and everyone's eyes are closed, and then he slowly does a narrative of taking off and climbing and then turning, and you can see all of the pilots going through the motions with their joystick in real time. Now, there are tremendous advantages for athletes to be able to do this. I went to a sports conference at MIT several years ago, and this is when the whole rage about Moneyball was coming in, what the Oakland athletes did in terms of using statistics to re-engineer the game and look for opportunities that were overlooked by traditional ways of approaching the game. And because of their success, it spawned a conference and it spawned transformation in several sports. One of the booths there was a virtual simulation booth for batters. So they'd get into the batting cage and they would simulate hitting the ball and they would simulate the pitch. And what they were saying is that this does a few things. It accelerates the number of repetitions an athlete can get to turning those behaviors or those motor skills into instinctive skills. Secondly, there's less wear and tear on the body. This is a new breakthrough, and we don't take advantage of that. And it's not hard to do, and I'll share with you how easy it is to do. We program the brain to optimize performance. So we have to have performance criteria. An athlete, of course, has the performance criteria of the time and the race they're in. And I'm going to use Michael Phelps as our example of that. It also elevates our desire. We have a goal in mind. So you have a goal or a wish. You imagine an outcome, what the time is, or what the performance criteria looks like. Then for athletes like Michael Phelps, they look at what could go wrong, what could happen, and they simulate that. And then they create a plan for doing that. This wish, outcome, obstacle, and plan was developed by Gabrielle Oettingen at Harvard in terms of a mental process or framework for imagining your best performance and being prepared for anything. Now, I've used this model for individuals getting ready to get in front of people to make a presentation. One individual I worked with had a very hard time of keeping their composure and remembering what they were going to say when they got in front of a client where the stakes were high. So we began to imagine and go through what this person wanted to have, the wish, and then the outcome, and then they would rehearse what that would be like, what could go wrong, what kind of questions could they ask, and then the plan. Now, one of the plans that this person came up with is to set up what you might call a Shark Tank, that's a TV show, where startup companies come in and present to a group of veteran investors who grill them through their business plan and their goals and the valuation and all of that. But imagine going in front of a friendly group in your office who are playing those roles and then practicing and rehearsing. The brain is a servo mechanism. That's another way of saying it's a guidance system or a goal-oriented organism. So those goals we talked about, the two main goals, are to get what I want and to protect me from what can hurt me. Those are the two main elements. In the 1970s, it was discovered that the brain operates very much like a guidance system. And the book Psycho-Cybernetics was the breakthrough book at that time by Maxwell Maltz. Let's say it's a missile. The missile needs a coordinate or a destination where it wants to go. Then it needs a mechanism for feedback. Am I on course or am I not on course? The clearer the coordinates, the more frequent and accurate the feedback, the more that missile stays on course. A thermostat is a servo mechanism. You set the temperature, then it monitors. It's got a thermometer in there, and when the temperature goes below that set point, it turns on the heat. If it goes above that set point, it turns off for a while. In the summer, it's reversed. The universe takes us off course. That's what it's designed to do. So imagine a missile or a rocket that only checked in once every 20 minutes or so, or that had fuzzy coordinates. You can imagine what might happen. And so this is what athletes have done. They have spent a lot of time clarifying the coordinates and also being able to anticipate being off course. What could throw me off course, and what would I do in that situation? How would I self-correct? Now, the destination that we're aiming for is our best self. To show up, to be optimized, to activate our strengths, to do what we naturally do best and enjoy most, to feel that rush of positive hormones. Gravity, in our case, is we've lost that genius and we have this tendency to want to pull down and fit the box that people have put us in over time. The resistance that rockets face, for us, the resistance is the inner story that we have, what others may say, the doubters, the people who don't support and passively just let us go without any kind of feedback at all in terms of whether we're on course or this might work. And then what we call our fixed mindset. A fixed mindset, I think it's Carol Dweck that developed this difference between a growth mindset and a fixed mindset. And a growth mindset essentially approaches something, and if they fail, what we would call fail, they don't frame it as failure. They frame it as not yet. In other words, I either succeed or I learn. That's the growth mindset. The fixed mindset looks at success, or what we would call failure, as failure, and it's me. I'm not good enough. I can't do this. So think of all the things over time and in the past that you've said, I'm just not cut out for this. I'd like to share the story of Christine. It's the opening story of the chapter. And in her situation, she was in a very small, intimate company of about 20 to 30 people. She was the head of marketing. They've been very successful over the last 20 years. She had her process down, her way of doing things. And then because of the success of the company, a larger company came and purchased it. All of a sudden, she's the new kid on the block. She's gone from being a big fish in a small pond to a very small fish in a big ocean. And there's life pressures too about the importance of the job as a sole breadwinner in the family, and then the uncertainty of what's going to happen in this organization. When we talked, she wanted to know, and her first gut level instinct was, I think I need to move on. This is not what I signed up for. And then we paused because, and I'll share another story. When we're going through disruption, what we have to realize is that the natural process of managing this is called grief or loss. Going through everything will be okay to, oh, nuts, it's a disaster. And then the disappointment and the anger and the emotional roller coaster, that's noise in the system. And the first thing we have to do is get some distance from the noise. And we did that by her coming to the ranch. I've got a ranch here, a leadership facility and a guest house. So she spent a couple days. We didn't spend a lot of time together. I spent time helping her craft the first draft of her genius paragraph and then giving her some guidance as to where to take this. She just spent the time walking in nature, thinking in the back deck, writing and journaling. So she got away from the noise and she created this beautiful, aspirational portrait of who she is at her best and in what context she thrives. The value of that was clarity. And moving from either romance, when there's a new idea, we either have the romance of the idea, that's the emotional side, or the fear of the idea. And then we hit the reality, and then we go into the hard part, the internal voice inside, what Stephen Pressfield calls the procrastination demon, or whatever gets in the way of us wanting to take action. That's a hard stage we go through, but clarity helps. Let this thing play out. It's not over. It hasn't settled. I know right now, initially, where you've been placed and the fact that nobody knows you or your history or your portfolio and you're not being well embraced. I said, let the dust settle. And then be prepared for that candid conversation with her boss, because one of the criteria or things that she was very concerned about, is he going to leave? And if he's going to leave, then I'm in this big ocean all by myself, no advocates, no navigator. So that was an important part of the conversation. With all of that said, and there's a happy outcome, the boss is enjoying, valued by the executive leadership of the company. There was a role that opened up in the company that was ideally fit for her. She's taken that role. She's thriving now, and even better, she's on a bigger stage. And her skills and her gifts and her magic are now being seen and acknowledged by a company that's close to 2,000 inside. So going from 20 to 30 people to now having a stage of 2,000 people, that's a huge jump. And again, she is thriving. I'll share another story. This is a recent one of an individual who has a wonderful role in their company, respected and doing great work, but some individuals in the company that he had high regard for made some decisions that now have broken that trust. Now they're wondering, where do I go? What do I do? And again, going back to the basics, let's clarify who you are at your best. What platform or what context does that look like? Let's get some distance. Go through your 5 stages of grief. When I talked to him, he was in the anger mode of grief. It was so helpful for him to know, oh, I'm in the middle of a process. And when he was able to identify that I'm in the anger stage and I'm pissed off, but I know it's going to be moving into some other stages, that gave him perspective. Then we looked at life priorities and just set the life priorities. Family first, your team second, your career third. The career will take care of itself, but taking care of others was a high priority for him. And we're still in the middle of that story. But I said, when the dust settles and you're clear about who you are at your best, and you've had these conversations with your family, you'll go from passion right now to calm conviction, and you'll make decisions based on your alignment with your values, your alignment with your strengths and talent, and your alignment with your primary responsibilities. There's something magical that takes place when someone takes several pages of an assessment and distills it into a portrait of themselves. And when this happens, I oftentimes get this first reaction. Sometimes it's a giggle, sometimes it's a, man, that feels good. There was the headmaster of a large private school, and they did that with their staff. And he shared with me with great enthusiasm when we did this and people shared their portrait of themselves. He said everybody's body language was, wow. And then someone says, yeah, that's Steve. What we're doing here with the portrait is we're taking either assessments or a life questionnaire that you've done, you're distilling it, boiling it down into a portrait of what you look like at your best. I like to say it's an evidence-based portrait of who you are at your best, your potential, what you naturally do best and enjoy most. I've shared many times that we use the Clifton Strengths for that. Our software is set up to help you distill that into a genius portrait. When science comes together with your experience and filtering it down with some reflection, and then you begin writing. There's something magical when you have these feelings and thoughts and you put them into writing. Something magical happens because then you get clarity. And then when you read it, and then you read it aloud, and then get the reaction of others, that is a transformational process. The good news is that there's lots of assessments out there. Psychometric tools give us such valuable information on our traits, our personalities, our natural strengths, our aptitudes. There's a wide range, and each assessment provides a focus on a different element. We will go from descriptive to distilling to predictive. When I work with somebody and their strengths, I can tell what their sweet spot is. In other words, what they should look like at their best. I know what can happen to them under pressure, where they will shift. We call that the kryptonite, how their strengths can get in their way. And I can also tell what it looks like, and when I'm working with something, if something isn't resonating, if they've got certain traits and they're not obvious, or the opposites are showing up, then we know there's something broken either in the trust, in the individual, in the situation, or something has happened that goes deeper than just understanding the natural tendencies of these traits. How do we go from drain to flow and recognize that according to Gallup, 70% of people are not activating their strengths on a daily basis. 50% of people are coasting. They're going through the motions. They're not passionate about what they do. They're not bringing their best. 20% are on that toxic range. And if you remember Bob's story at the very beginning, he had gone from this individual who loved the organization they're with to what we call that cave dweller, consistently against virtually everything. That's the acronym. Was angry, bitter, reactive. There's a continuum that people fall through. And as an FYI, according to Gallup, you get the best out of people their first 6 months. Then reality begins to set in, and then they start moving into that middle of the boat or back of the boat, that 50% in the middle or 20% in the back. Athletes, when we say they're in their zone, we talk about they're in their sweet spot. Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, one of the founders of positive psychology, along with his colleague Martin Seligman in 1999, he was focusing on intrinsic happiness. How do we optimize intrinsic happiness? He looked at athletes and musicians who get into this fluid state of rapture and flow, and oftentimes very dispassionate but very focused. Think about times or the things you like to do that fit that same category. There is this Goldilocks zone, and it's a continuum. It's the difficulty of the job and the novelty. Those two things have to hit a sweet spot. And he says it's about a 4% higher level of complexity or challenge that is optimal for someone to get into the flow state. And there's other criterias. One is having a goal. Number two, that novelty. Number three, that complexity. And then getting into that flow state is something that athletes train themselves to do, and musicians. I've trained myself to get into a flow state. I set aside from 7 o'clock in the morning to 9 o'clock in the morning to get into that flow state. And it normally takes about 15 or 20 minutes to get absorbed. I have to look at the day before and have things lined out so I don't get sidetracked and sucked in to news or emails, that I can sit down and know that the things I've laid out will get me into a flow state, either creating content or like I was doing this morning, going through the chapter and reliving the chapter and writing notes and finding things I wanted to add to it. It was a wonderful feeling and time of getting into that flow. The way Mihai Csikszentmihalyi talks about it is that when you're in flow, it's soul satisfying. Now, why? First of all, you're releasing the mix of positive hormones. Dopamine is that pleasure hormone, and that's usually stage one. Endorphins is when you're in that flow state. We call that sometimes the runner's high, or being totally absorbed. When you're in relational rhythm, psychological safety, feeling connected, that's serotonin. And we all have been in conversations or been with people where we've just lost track of time and it's been flowing. And then the oxytocin, think of that as the flow state in relationships where it gets into that depth of intimacy. Some other things are happening that are reinforcing or virtuous cycles or virtuous loops. When you're releasing these hormones, you're also strengthening the neural pathways of these signals, and you're strengthening them because what gets released is a protein. It's called myelin. And what covers all of the neurons is something called a myelin sheath. Think of it like the insulation on electrical wiring. The thicker that myelin, the faster and stronger the signal. Doing this repetition over and over again, think of a musician, a professional musician or a well-trained musician like my son. He can come to the house, get on his piano, and just begin playing classical scores or jazz scores from memory. It's not always perfect, but all of the instincts and the rhythms and the things are there. When we talk about athletes and we talk about musicians, we call it muscle memory. It's not muscle memory. It's those myelin sheath. It's the instincts of doing things over and over again. Moving to Glen Rose, Texas, I haven't been able to play tennis for 2 years, but I can still get on the court and with 5 or 10 minutes get back into the groove and rhythm because of the years of doing it over and over again. Now imagine repeating or reading your paragraph of who you are at your best and imagining situations where you're going to be at your best and what that looks like over and over again. That virtual simulation. Imagine doing that and becoming more and more natural and instinctive of who you are at your best. So there's a virtuous cycle and a vicious cycle. Bob was caught in that vicious cycle. Bob was in a role where he was dealing with young, entitled air traffic controllers who had high school degrees, but not college degrees. They were part of a union, and he had no natural skills to be diplomatic, to understand what's going on, to play the politics. Imagine every single day you feel like you're pushing rope uphill, that you're in this cortisol stress state all day long, and over time you devolve into that person who first checks out and then begins to get angry and then gets to that rage state that Bob was at, that cave dweller consistently against virtually everything. Then there's that virtuous cycle of continually reinforcing who I am at my best, how to play at my strengths, and how to become instinctive around it. Dale Carnegie said years and years ago that whatever the mind can conceive, it can achieve. And this is what sports science is all about. I shared with you the Blue Angels story. Now I want to share with you about Michael Phelps. So during the China Olympics, Michael Phelps was having problems with his goggles. The water was getting in it. In the 100 butterfly, that's the fourth gold medal, water got in the goggles, but he still broke the world record. In the seventh race, 200 butterfly, now imagine having competed 6 times previously. In the seventh race, the goggles filled with water. Now, what does that do? It means you're blind. You can't see what you're doing. He narrowly won by 1/100th of a second. In fact, he was behind up until the last 10 meters. It looked miraculous how he pulled it out. He was trained to talk about what if training. What if this happens? What if that happens? But he mentally visualized. His default mechanism, going back to Gabrielle Oettingen's model of wish, outcome, obstacle, plan, was going through the obstacle. What happens if my goggles fill with water? And the plan is count your strokes. We automatically went to counting his strokes. He would say, the way he would go through the WHOOP process is what you want it to be, what it could be, what you don't want it to be, and what if this happens? I worked with somebody using the WHOOP model. This was an individual that was struggling at work because they had a similar profile to Bob, and in meetings would say things that were caustic and disrespectful, not being aware of it. We worked on that with our process of what we call the circle of feedback. We have a process of giving people feedback on what they look like at their best, their genius paragraph and their kryptonite. We narrowed it down to one specific trait that the person tends to say and act before they think. We came up with a plan, strategy, on how to slow that down. But now the person came to me and said, I've got a wedding to go to. I haven't seen my son in 10 years. My ex is going to be there. My in-laws are going to be there. We don't get along. So her wish is that her son would be glad she came. We talked through the outcome. To be gracious and congenial under any conditions. The obstacle, of course, were the in-laws, the memories, the things they might say. And the plan was to walk through her paragraph every day, her genius paragraph, and imagine the situations and how that paragraph would respond to those situations. 6 months later, I get an excited email, pictures, and it went wonderful. She was elated. But more importantly, it changed her life. So let's revisit a couple of items here as we get into the action. So the first step, and this is part of getting rid of the baggage of the old, is reframing ourselves. Remember, Ahmed Sud talks about that 80% of our non-directed thoughts go to the negative. Cognitive behavior therapy takes a similar approach. They ask you, what's the story that you're telling yourself about situations and individuals, and is it working for you? Is it moving you forward, or is it working against you, even putting you into a victim mode? Revisiting our paragraphs in those situations over and over, changing the story in our brain of what we look like at our best, reframing the situation and the story, refocusing on how to be our best, and then reimagining what that might look like. Step 2, after reframing, we start connecting the dots, the highlight reel. I've gone back in life and looked at the highlight moments of my life. I've connected it to my paragraph and my traits. Over a week, I will look at the highlight moments of the week and then connect it back to my traits. Daily, I use a practice called bookend days. In the morning, I will read my paragraph I did this morning. Then I will imagine how am I going to show up at my best in whatever context, in this LinkedIn Live. I've got a podcast this afternoon. And so I'm imagining how I'm going to bring all my strengths alive. And then I'll look at what did I do in that moment? What was the action? How did it feel? What came alive in me? What were the outcomes in response? Last week, I was on a large project, largest project I've ever been on, over $2 billion, very complex, historical facility. And the problems are on a magnitude of scale. They're not complicated, they're complex, and they're interlinked, overwhelming. I went off script in the afternoon to try to give this new team we were onboarding. We did Genius Spark in the morning, and then we worked around an exercise, what keeps you up at night. We grouped those together. We had 3 teams. Then we had each team take one of the top 3 items that keep them up. And then here is my pivot. I said, I want each team to combine the 3 and look for what's common underneath them and find a way to re-engineer how we approach that. The normal process is just simple problem solving. We've got a parking issue here, so how do we get more parking? We'll have buses. Simple reductive solution. The challenge in a complex system is that focusing on one item and not the system and the interconnectedness, interdependencies, and the unintended consequences, what they were experiencing is when they approached a problem like that, it would create 3 or 4 more problems. So they were going deeper and deeper into the weeds on it. I did a pivot, had them do that. The first 5 or 10 minutes, I'm wondering, did I make a good decision here? Because they're struggling, they're frustrated. I encourage them to keep going, that let the process work, let them have the conversations, and then magic started to happen. This group of individuals from about 5 or 6 separate companies, we had 22 people, all intermixed, all of a sudden began coalescing, getting very engaged, finding something, building on one another, and not countering people's ideas, but finding ways to incorporate the idea like you would find in a good improv. The yes and dynamic was beginning to take place. It felt great. Yesterday, I talked to 2 of the key leaders that came in after, and they said, boy, this was the best one we've done. Everybody was jazzed. We're going to give them the freedom to take this approach they wanted to take. Then I went back to one of my paragraphs, and I've got several versions, and I read it. You're a master at orchestrating teams to achieve a common goal. Your leadership is instrumental in bringing people together to accomplish great things. And I said, nailed it. That's what the brain needs. It needs that criteria. It needs to experience. It needs to go back and remind, that's where I did it. And the activation, the myelin, getting stronger. The benefit of that, what you'll see over time, is that these instincts and gut level things that you have will not be delayed reactions. They'll be in real time. That's why I pivoted. I took a risk in real time. I didn't second guess myself. I did after the first 5 minutes, but I went there because that's who I am. I am the person who orchestrates teams to achieve a common goal and accomplish great things. That's me. I do that. In the book, you'll see another example of Jason, who had a challenge of a very hard conversation, and he's got some strengths that would rather make everything be nice and go away. And he sent me a text and said, this is my paragraph. I nailed it. I overcame. We need to remind ourselves and celebrate those victories. A lot of times what we naturally do is not obvious, and it comes out in stories. So there's the story of Kim, who naturally is organized, calm. She was having a hard time seeing it was magical, and then she shared a story of her daughter moving to a new apartment and having friends coming over, and nobody was doing anything. And then Kim naturally went to work, and within an hour, it was all put together. Her daughter was amazed watching her mom in action. But her mom just took it for granted, didn't really realize that was part of her magic. And then I started asking about her tendency to be organized and bring order to chaos. I asked, what's your closet like? How is it organized? By season or color? She said, by color. So where does all the miscellaneous stuff go in the house? Do you have a junk drawer? No junk drawer. How are the coffee mugs organized? All the handles are in the same direction. Then, knowing this and knowing the traits, I said, do I have to take my shoes off when I come into your house? Absolutely. She began to see her magic, see the traits through story. And oftentimes it's hard to see them because they're listed. And even in a paragraph, the stories bring it out. We have to go back and master the fundamentals. Think of musicians. They play scales over and over. And it allows them, for example, my son with jazz, it allows him to be in a quartet and to improvise because it's all instinctive and second nature. And he can be in the flow and the rhythm, in the conversation of the music back and forth instead of thinking about his fingering or the scale that he's playing. It's very similar to watching kids advance in music. We've all seen the kids when they start out and it's choppy and corrections and very mechanical. And then in middle school, it's out of tune a bit and not in sync. High school gets better, college gets better, then Carnegie Hall. It's beauty in sound. That's how we work together. In the assessment we use, there's 33,600,000 different combinations of the top 5 strengths. It begins as noise with us. It begins as doubting what we can do or coming delayed reaction. And over time, we begin to master ourselves. But think of what happens when a group comes together. It's just like that band and taking it from people who are at different levels of mastering their strengths to then bringing it together to a team that functions in harmony like the team I had last week. The third step is to enhance. I've rewritten my paragraph multiple times. And when I go back and I find a new piece that came alive that gave me new insight, then I go back and wordsmith. Think of this process. We start out in discovery. We get insight. We have some experience and we begin to craft the portrait. And then something happens and we go back to discovery again, insight, experience. This is a loop. And this is how I continue to refine and enhance my paragraph. I've got a different paragraph for each day of the week because I want to keep it fresh and I want to focus and highlight different kinds of elements in my traits. Habit. The final thing we're going to talk about is the habit. Having a set time to rehearse and to reflect. And then the habit of linking what we do with our actions with our strengths. Think of the morning and the evening as the 2 times a day you have the most discretion or control. That's the first step I would think of in terms of creating habit. Create a routine. Link that routine with something else. Do you have morning coffee? It's a perfect time to have your genius paragraph there and read it. Or if you're in the car, record it on a voice memo and then listen to it. In the evening, do you journal or do you write emails? Whatever it is, substitute or include the habit of reflecting on the highlight moments of the day. What traits did they connect to? Donald Clifton talked about the primary mindset back in the 40s that he was trying to shift. He's the father of what's called strength psychology, the grandfather of positive psychology, and he wanted to move the industry of psychology and move us personally from a focus on what's wrong to what's strong. part of what we need every day is to have a positive counter narrative to all the voices, all the ups and downs that we experience to become our best selves. So thank you for spending this time. We've finished chapter 5. If you want to get some of the previous recordings, reach out to us. We have it on Teachable. So we've not only taken the chapters, we've transcribed them, put them into lesson plans so that you can lead your own teams in this kind of book study. Thank you very much, and we'll see you in the next LinkedIn Live.